So there's only one way to learn a language, by getting All right, everyone. So today I'm joined by Dr. Van Patten, a renowned scholar who specializes in second language acquisition. And today we're going to talk about Dr. Crescen's comprehensible input hypothesis or theory. Dr. Van Patten is such a highly respected scholar and now a writer, right? So you made that big transition in your career. And he's quoted widely among scholars across the world. So if you're into applied linguistics and second language acquisition, you probably heard of him or even read his papers as well. Dr. Van Patten, welcome. Would you like to introduce yourself quickly to our viewers?
Sure. I don't know what else I would say other than I was thinking about this the other day as an academic and as now a fiction writer, how many millions and millions of words I must have written in my career. It's quite a few. I was tracking this the other day because I had to do something. And I think I've done something like 9 or 10 academic books, 8 or 9 edited volumes, something like 200 articles and book chapters. I've given like 1,000 talks over the years. Now I'm on my 6th novel, my 3rd collection of short stories. So myself, and the printed word have a very intimate relationship. And I think I'll just say that, let it go.
Right. So you recently made a career transition from being a scholar to being a full-time writer. What was that like? And what made you make that transition in your life?
I still have one foot in the second language acquisition door, but it is a foot. And I don't teach anymore. I left teaching in 2018, was the last year I taught. I left Michigan State. Prompted it was, I had visited my sister for Christmas the year before, and I realized that she's older than I am. She's not getting any younger. I'm not getting any younger. And we've been apart for lots of years because I grew up in California, but my career was in Illinois, Texas, Michigan. And I just decided I wanted to move back to California and be near my sister. So I just packed up my bags and left. I started my first novel and I thought, okay, what I'll do is I'll just transition then. I'll just write full time because that's what I want to do. And so it was actually a personal decision because of my relationship with my sister. So that.
Wow. I can't imagine the bond that you have with your sibling. That's amazing.
Yeah, a lot of people think I retired, but I didn't. I'm not emeritus. You know, when you retire, called Professor Emeritus. Actually, I just left. And so again, I still have one foot in that acquisition door. I have colleagues across the country I still work with and interact with. I've got some chapters and articles coming out this year, for example. I mean, there's a number of projects I'm working on. So I'm still there.
Oh, that sounds great. So speaking of your career transition, I have your book here with me, your latest book. So would you like to briefly explain what inspired you to write this book and what do you love about this book?
It's an interesting book, Refuge. It came out of the idea of what would happen if someone in California was confronted by somebody who lived in a state in the United States where abortion had been outlawed, and this person was in desperate need of help. Those are the politics, that's the reality of the United States right now. We have states where you have reproductive freedom and states where you do not. Out of that basic conflict, that set of cultural and political issues, I thought, okay, who would my characters be? And then the story just went from there. So it's a very, very timely book. This is in the forefront of American political discussion and social discussion right now. Yeah, it was inspired by that.
So I started reading this over the Lunar New Year holiday, and I love this. You know, especially I like how descriptive the content is. So a lot of Korean EFL learners, which is the topic that we're gonna spend a lot of time on talking about. Basically, they don't have access to everyday English expressions, like just simple expressions that describe people's actions or gestures and behaviors. And I loved how this book contains that all, you know, like I could picture the characters' facial expressions, like even the micro expressions on their face. And it felt like I was watching a film, right? So I really love that. If you're intermediate to advanced level EFL learners, you know, this is going to be a very compelling novel and such an interesting book that you would like to get yourself one. So get a copy. I'm going to leave the link to Amazon.com where you can purchase this book. And I'm pretty sure they ship this book internationally to South Korea as well. So if you're interested, go get a copy. This is amazing.
You can also just go to my website, billvanpatten.net, and all of my books and fiction are there, and there's links to Amazon and Barnes & Noble and other places. So you can just go there. That's actually easier. So
Alrighty, I'm going to make sure that I have that URL in the description box down below as well. All right, great. So speaking of compelling input and compelling novels, we can, I guess, transition to the main topic that we have today, Dr. Krashen's comprehensible input hypothesis. So Dr. Van Patten, could you introduce the hypothesis or theory to our viewers in a simple layman's terms?
The first thing I want to do, though, is say the following, because I actually was writing to Steve Krashen the other day, and I said, why are we still calling this a hypothesis in 2024? Since the origins of contemporary second language research, which was the early to mid 70s, 1970s, we have a tremendous amount of empirical research done. And what has emerged over that time is that the role of communicatively embedded and comprehensible input in language acquisition as the source of how learners acquire language is a fact. It's not a hypothesis, it's a fact. So I don't know how we want to call it, but we need to stop calling it a hypothesis because it's not conjecture. It's not something that needs to be tested. Hypotheses are meant to be tested. The role of input now in language acquisition is a fact accepted by almost all mainstream theories in second language acquisition. So with that said, so what is this fact? The basic fact is this, that to create an unconscious and implicit mental representation of language, any language, English, Korean, Spanish, German, Russian, to create that unconscious implicit mental representation, you need access to and interaction with language that you hear, read, or see, in the case of signing, if you're in the deaf community, or you're learning a deaf language. You as a learner, what you're doing is trying to understand what someone is saying, writing, or signing. And through that process of trying to understand what someone is saying, language acquisition slowly builds up in your head over time. It's not that acquisition builds up. Language grows in your head over time through acquisition, I should say. That's basically the hypothesis in a nutshell. You learn, you get language in your head by comprehending language you're exposed to.
So there are several elements to it, right? What are they?
That is the main element. There really aren't any other elements. There was one that Steve Krashen had put in, the I+1, that what you need for progress to happen is you need language slightly beyond your current level. The problem with that construct is that's an untestable construct. And so most of us don't even talk about that anymore because we can't measure what I+1 is.
For most part, I think Krashen's theory is almost commonsensical, right? It's really hard to argue with common sense, right? What throws people off is the absolute confidence in input. And, as an educator and a teacher, I believe in, I know what I'm doing, and I believe in the impact that I have on my students. And what triggers me is when Dr. Krashen says, this is the only way to learn a language, which I believe is in part true and in part not true, because there are so many different students who come from different cultures and who are stuck in different educational systems and who come with different linguistic talent and so forth. So I think that's the thing that people are still arguing over, and that's where the whole controversy comes from. So what do you think about the absolute nature of Krashen's theory?
Well, the absolute nature of that is that he's absolutely correct, that there isn't a person on earth who does not acquire language without access to communicatively embedded, and comprehensible input. That again is a fact. Now, what you need to understand is the research on this. We have research in all contexts, in all ages, in and out of educational settings, in the US, in China, in Japan, in Europe. We have young kids, teenagers, adults, and the picture is pretty clear to us, which is why all the major theories have converged on this one fact that, yes, indeed, input plays some fundamental role. I think there are two confusions here, if I may. One is the fact that input is necessary does not mean it guarantees acquisition, right? It doesn't. It just means you can't have acquisition without it. The second thing is that the fact that you're in an educational situation that's different from mine, or that you're even in an educational situation to begin with, does not obviate the need for input. It doesn't. You just because you're in a school setting in Korea or a school setting in Japan or a school setting in, I don't know, where Nebraska in the United States, does not mean that the role of input somehow vanishes. It doesn't. It's still there. It's part of what your brain and your mind need.
More on the absolute nature of Dr. Christian's theory again. And I'm here playing devil's advocate just to make sure our viewers are happy with what they're learning from this video. So I'm absolutely confident that input is an important and necessary part of language acquisition. I can attest to that because I learn English as my second language. But saying that it's an absolutely necessary feature of language acquisition is one thing, and saying that's the only way you can learn a foreign language or a second language is quite another, in my opinion, right? I think Christian's theory is very important in understanding how language is acquired. You know, I do reflect his theory in my curriculum. I write interesting stories. I sometimes hire story writers, and then I hire some illustrators to make it more engaging. And then I give them a lecture using that textbook. So this is not simply compelling input. This is input plus instructions, guidance, and so forth, right? So what I would like to truly understand as an educator and learn from you is, if Christian's input hypothesis plays such an important role and it's the only way to learn a foreign language, what's the role of other elements of language learning, like teachers' roles and all those teaching methodologies out there? What are the roles that teachers and educators are playing here in this?
Well, that's up to teachers to decide once they have the basic facts of language acquisition under their belts. So let me just back up and say that for a minute, then I'm going to come back to your question.
Sure.
My experience with teachers around the world is most of them don't have the basic facts of language acquisition in front of them. Somehow in teacher education around the world, the basic facts are ignored. Teachers are trained to treat language like other subject matter. So whether it's math, history, science, or languages, it's all the same when it comes to an educational system. And those of us who work in linguistics and psycholinguistics and language acquisition say, yeah, you can treat language like subject matter. That's called linguistics. That's what you do in a linguistics course. But if your goal is language acquisition and development of some kind of communicative ability, then language doesn't work like other subject matter. And your theories of education kind of go out the window. And the only way to understand why that is true is to know the basic facts about language acquisition. Again, those are largely ignored in teacher preparation programs and even in continuing professional development. There's such a concern with theory. In fact, I just wrote about this in a chapter of the 4th edition of our theories book. People are so concerned with theories, and teachers are told to worry about Krashen's theory or Van Patten's theory or linguistic theory or whatever, without understanding what are the basic facts that these theories are trying to account for, because that's what theories do. So I challenge you to find teachers who can list the 10 basic facts of language acquisition that we all know, that we've known for like 30 or 40 years. With that said, now I'm going to segue into answering your question. For example, my class, when I used to teach languages, my classes were structured around all kinds of different things: interaction, input, surveys we'd take, stories we'd read, stories we'd tell, all kinds of things. And my job as a teacher then was to develop themes and content around which we're trying to answer basic questions. Let me give you one example. I might start a class with what does it mean to have a close relationship with your parents, right? And I get my students to help me brainstorm on what does a close relationship mean. In any language they don't have, they tell me in their first language, and I put it on the board in the second language. And from that, we start to develop this idea of what a close relationship is. And in one class, one time when I did this, some guy said in Spanish that he was a mommy's boy. Well, at that point in time, I abandoned what I was going to do, or what I thought discussion would go, and we veered into the direction of starting to talk about what's a mommy's boy. And so my role as a teacher then is to keep the students engaged. I should call them learners, not students. To keep the learners engaged in the content. And there's all different kinds of ways to do that. It doesn't just mean I think a lot of people think if you want to get input in the classroom, it means you're talking at students or you're throwing input at students. No, you're talking with students. You're developing stories with students. You're reading stories with students. There's a tremendous amount of interaction and other kinds of structured tasks that happen in a class. And that's what the teacher's role is, to figure out how to do that. And there's different kinds of ways to do that. All different kinds of ways to do that. There's no single way to do it.
Mm-hmm. So basically encouraging them to talk or interact with each other?
No, not interact with each other, but interact with you. In a sense of, learners aren't little sponges you sit there, again, and talk at. Mm-hmm. They have to somehow interact with the input they're exposed to, whatever kind of input that is. And that kind of interaction changes. In the lowest levels, it might be facial expressions, one-word responses. It might be pointing to things. Who knows what it's going to be? And as the language grows, then their interaction changes, and you get more than one word. You get short sentences and so on. So their ability to produce language emerges over time, and how they interact with the input changes over time. Mm-hmm. So it's the teacher's job to figure out how to get that input in there, and then what kind of interaction makes sense for a given level and a given point in time, and so on.
So if we can talk about EFL environments more, right? What I like this interview to achieve is helping educators and students, learners alike, learn how to more effectively learn a second language, whether that's English or Spanish or whatever. So I would like to provide this, like a little context about the educational environment in Korea. So at this point in time in 2024, what a lot of parents do, mostly middle class or more affluent parents do, is they send their kids to immersion schools when their kids are like 4 or 5. So there are a lot of American teachers or Canadian teachers who teach them and only speak to them in English, which I think is great. But there's a big hurdle that Korean EFL learners have to overcome, which is college admissions tests. So by the time they're like 12 or 10, parents switch gears and they send them to cram schools, because now they have to make sure their kids do well on the test, right? And kids, they don't have a choice. That's why in our previous email interaction, I said, to me, questions theory sounds a little too idealistic because of this whole cultural context that I'm aware of. So what happens is you have to, at some point in your life, you have to make the transition to studying to excel in a test, right? And that's not your choice. You're basically forced to follow that path. And then after you took care of all the college admission stuff and you graduate from let's say a very prestigious school, now the real language learning begins. And I help people who went through all that with all that grammar focused teaching, and like they are never asked to speak a word. Their speaking ability, their overall language proficiency is not tested at all. So even though they might excel in exams, they can just get the top score, but they cannot speak English fluently. And even there are cram schools that help them prepare for like a speaking test, like the TOEIC speaking test. So they nail it, but then when they get hired, and their employers will expect them to speak English fluently because they have this score that proves their English proficiency, but then they cannot speak, right? So that's the issue that we have at hand here. And these are people that I would like to help. These are people that I want you to help with all your knowledge about second language acquisition.
Let's say two things. First is the scenario you're describing is not unique to Korea, right? That's a scenario I know throughout parts of Asia, parts of Europe, parts of the United States, if not a vast majority of places in the United States, where tests drive curriculum and drive teachers' behaviors. We as acquisitionists and as linguists and as psycholinguists can't help that. That's a political issue. That's not an acquisition or learning issue. Acquisition happens a certain way, end of story. I can't help any situation about the politics of how curricula are driven by tests, other than what I normally do, which is I help teachers become informed. My idea, my goal, and this is definitely idealistic, is we need an army of teachers who can help effect change. Only teachers, and along with researchers, can tell politicians and people who make these decisions about tests and so on change their minds. Only teachers and researchers can do that. It has to be together. It's not just the research, not just the teachers, it's together. And so what you're describing is how education and classrooms are an artifact of a political situation or an economic and political situation, as opposed to being informed by how languages are acquired. That is something that research can't help other than to pinpoint that that's what the problem is and how do you go about solving it. Think about things like climate change. There's so much research out there about climate change, right? And I know there are people who deny climate change, but the research to me is overwhelming. Yet trying to get governments and politics to move in such a way to deal with climate change is separate from the science and facts about climate change, right? So it's the same thing. Not the same thing, but it's an analogy, I guess. You're describing a political situation that is uninformed by what we know about language acquisition.
Yeah, exactly. So I think even though I was playing devil's advocate, just to make sure we answered all the questions that our viewers have earlier, what you just said made me so confident that we actually agree on pretty much everything here, I guess. Language acquisition happens in this way and this way only, but now we have political situations and some problems with certain educational system. And then we have problems at hand and teachers are involved. They're trying to figure out a better way to help their students. So I don't see any disagreement here. So what I mean by saying we agree on pretty much everything is that when Dr. Van Patten said Dr. Crescen's comprehensible input theory is the only way language is acquired, he was talking about science, and science is about facts. Now, when facts exist individually, you cannot make any judgment about them because, after all, they're facts. Put into a cultural, economic, and political context, however, things get more nuanced. Let me give you an example. I would like to use a tteokbokki analogy. So, for example, to make tteokbokki, you need rice cake because it's the main ingredient. Without rice cake, you cannot make tteokbokki. That's a fact. There's no point in arguing over this because tteokbokki is made from rice cake the same way language acquisition happens through exposure to comprehensible input. Now, let's throw in politics. Let's say in South Korea, rice cakes are banned.
it's illegal to make rice cakes. This doesn't change the fact that tteokbokki should still be made from rice cake. But the problem is, the political situation in the country makes it impossible for people to make tteokbokki with rice cake without breaking the law. You see my point here? Science is science, and facts are facts, but they exist independently from the complexity of reality. This is exactly what I've been talking about the whole time. Dr. Krashen's theory, even though opinions about it may vary from person to person, has its own merits. However, when it comes to its applicability, it cannot solve real-world problems, such as students not being able to speak fluently despite their high test scores. Because in the real world, we have an array of problems regarding the economics of education, teaching methodologies, and politics. Ask a Korean chef a gazillion times whether he can make tteokbokki without using rice cake, and you'll get the same answer a gazillion times. No. The chef is simply stating a fact. But facts don't change the economic, educational, and political realities that we're all in.
Could I just add one thing real quick?
Sure.
What concerns me is I don't want teachers to walk away thinking that input is some technique or method now that you can use to teach the same old thing. That's not what we're about. Input is not some new way to teach grammar from your textbook. It's not some new way to teach vocabulary from your textbook. And in fact, in my classroom, there is no textbook because what's in textbooks, the grammar in textbooks, it's not what winds up in your head. That's not language. Language is something completely different. And so teachers have to be careful of not trying to make input something they use to teach the same old thing, because that will be doomed to failure. And the doom to failure happens because teachers go, oh, look, my test scores now are lower. Well, of course they're lower because you're using the same old tests to measure the same old thing, but input is not a technique to use to teach the same old thing. So I want to make sure that people, your audience understands that what we're talking about here. It's quite a radical departure from thinking about what classrooms are.
If I can go back to the cultural context again, we have this problem that we have to resolve with Korean EFL learners. Again, the reason why I describe Krashen's theory idealistic is we have priorities in life, like your sibling, or I have my daughter to take care of, and my wife as well, and my aging parents and all that, and my career and my business. So in a perfect world, people have all the time in the world to themselves they can dedicate to language acquisition or language learning, but in reality, that's not the case. Busy with their work and with their job and their childcare responsibilities and all that, and they try to find time in their hectic life to study English. So for example, when they get off work at 5 p.m., they get home by 7, they cook dinner for their children, and then they sit down, it's 9 o'clock, and they spend a couple hours watching Netflix, right? Trying to get that compelling input with visual stimulation and all that. When people think of that kind of approach, they think like, oh, so if I watch Netflix series, if I binge watch Netflix, does that mean I'll be able to speak English someday? I think that's the confusion that a lot of people have. So are there any advice they would like to share with people who are confused about Krashen's approach to language acquisition?
Again, two things here. One is that, let's be careful of our wording here. There's nothing idealistic about Krashen's position or theory or whatever you want to call it. Theories are theories and frameworks are frameworks. They are not neither idealistic nor pessimistic nor anything. They just exist. They are attempts to account for the facts that we know. What may be idealistic is implications people draw from them for practical concerns like teaching, right? So I get that. So I want to make sure people understand that a position that a theory takes in and of itself is neutral, right? Now, with that said, I think the confusion that people have, again, and we said this earlier, and that's that the need for input doesn't mean having input thrown at you. Look at little kids, how they learn their first language. Input's not thrown at them. They're constantly interacting with the language. They are socializing the language. They are playing and they're doing all kinds of things in the language. Even when they are just only have one word and just can say no or ba or whatever it is they can say. They are interacting with the language in some way. They're not sitting there passively or just watching a TV. So this idea that the role of input means just sit there and passively do something that's a wrong conclusion. I mean, it just makes no sense to me that be the conclusion. The fact that something is necessary doesn't mean that you just sit there passively. No, when I was learning French as a second language, I didn't just sit there and watch French movies or read French books, although I did. I sought out like French groups there where I went to school. When I went to graduate school, there were lots of French speakers. And I had a French speaking office mate. I told her, speak to me in French. And so we started doing that. And she invited me. She said, there's a group of us who are French speakers. You should come to our coffee. They met at this coffee place. I go, sure. So I sought out interaction with native speakers. I've taught in Quebec in the summer. I spent a summer in France, chat rooms, all kinds of things. You have to be an active interactor with the language. You don't just sit there. I mean, that doesn't mean you can't learn by just sitting there, but think about how interaction works. Let's just say you say something to me in English, and I look at you and I go, huh? The minute I do that, it gives you a signal that your message was not well received by me. I didn't get it. So you might rephrase it and I go, I still don't get it. So then you say it a different way, or you break a sentence up, and all of a sudden that input that you're giving me now becomes more relevant and more comprehensible because I was part of the interaction that gave you signal. If I'm sitting there in front of a TV, I can't tell Netflix, excuse me, I didn't understand that. Can you repeat that? That's not how it works. So interaction is an important part of language acquisition simply because it helps you get better input and more tailored things in a given moment that help push acquisition along. So I want to get away from this idea of passivity. Learners are not passive recipients of input in any situation, whether it's a classroom, non-classroom. There have to be other ways to interact with the language and interact with speakers.
I was born and raised in Korea, and the first time I visited the States was when I was 30. So yeah, I came a long way from not being able to speak English at all to English proficiency and fluency. The thing is that people in Korea, they're again like stuck in this educational system. So the order got all twisted. They learn their grammar first, and they do a lot of test prep, and they waste their teenage years doing that, right? And the result is a bunch of people who can read and who can maybe write, but cannot speak, right? So the conclusion that I can draw from your answer is that it's up to teachers in Korea how they're going to solve this problem, because that's the result of the wrong approach to language acquisition.
Right. That's because somebody that is their quote unquote superior in the system, the educational system, is mandating testing or particular kinds of grading or something that then dictates behaviors to teachers and students. So that again is the cart before the horse. Rather than letting acquisition or what we know about how languages are acquired inform the curriculum is formed by testing, which the teachers have no control over.
The biggest problem, I think, is the economics of it. Because, for example, if you want to test their speaking skills, you're going to have to hire, thousands of native speakers to test their speaking abilities. And that doesn't really make any practical sense to educators with authority and power in Korea, I guess.
That's the same situation exists in the United States. There's been a movement for a number of decades now for what's called oral proficiency testing. And I won't talk about what I think has happened to that and how I think some of that testing has been warped. But the concept is solid, right? The problem is, you're exactly right. It has never taken off in the United States because if you want a proficiency outcome from your curricula, that means you have thousands of schools across the United States that need somehow to test oral proficiency, and thousands of universities where you want to test oral proficiency as learners come out of the curriculum. Right? So that's an issue. And there might be other ways to do it that aren't about testing. I've talked about this I used to have a podcast and radio show, and I talked about this off and on. And we don't have time to get into it here. But there are ways to restructure the things you do in class so you have evidence of that proficiency. And when learners hit a certain level, you can basically, as a teacher, say, yep, the learners, because they've done this, this, and this, and this, and these tasks in my class, I can pretty much guarantee they're intermediate high speakers of English, for example. But again, that requires giving teachers some time and training to do that.
So lastly, so you just talked about intermediate to advanced speakers who speak a language as a second language. So do you think, depending on the stage at which they're at, their approach to studying or learning a foreign language should be different?
Not really. I tell people that it's input and interaction with input all along the way. What changes is the nature of your interaction and possibly the nature of the input. I mean, let's look at it this way. A child learning a first language, a lot of people don't understand that children don't really have an adult-like system until almost puberty. They've got a lot by the time they're about 5 years old, but then there are lots of things that aren't there yet. And what we've learned in looking at first language acquisition is that all the really basic parts of language, by basic, I mean, there's quite a few, are there by 5, but there's an impact of literacy on language. And so the example I always like to give people are passive structures in English. So like the cow kicked the horse is an active sentence. The horse was kicked by the cow is a passive sentence, right? Kids at the age of 5 or so in English, most of the time they hear that the horse was kicked by the cow and they misinterpret the sentence. They think the horse did the kicking and the cow got kicked. And it's not until the age of 9 or 10 that we start to see these kids, when they're retested, start to have more adult-like interpretations, right? They're not always 100% correct, but they're better than they were when they were 5. Well, how did that happen? It's because passive structures are not very frequent in spoken English. They're much more frequent in written English. So where do you get exposure through the input to passives? Through reading. And so literacy starts to have an impact on your own language development as a first language speaker. I can give you all kinds of examples from different languages where this happens. I just give that one because I think it's simple and easy to understand. And there's also research that shows, you ready for this? That with adult English speakers, if you compare college educated and non-college educated speakers of English, the college educated speakers are faster and more accurate at interpreting passive sentences than those who are not college educated. It's not that they studied passives, it's just that they've been exposed to a lot more through written language. So that's an example of how the quality of input can change over time, what you get exposed to, and how that can impact language acquisition and your interaction with that, right? So when you're in the early stages, you might not read as much, but in the later stages, you read more and you get more written input, and that impacts subtly your system.
So, before we wrap up, going back to your book, let's do a quick thought experiment, right? Because you're an expert of second language acquisition. So if our readers can actually get their hands on this book and start reading this, for example, here where context is obviously Korean EFL learners. Let's say they got this book and start reading it, they can go back and forth, like looking for expressions. That's a compelling quality input, right? And we also touch upon the importance of interaction and the target language that you're trying to acquire. So if you are a teacher helping out adult Korean EFL learners, what recommendations do you have for those who want to read this book? How to benefit from your book and how to maybe put that to use, put all the knowledge they acquired or obtained reading this book to use?
Oh, that's a tough question. I didn't know you were going to ask me that question. Yeah, I don't know. As a native speaker of English, when I read fiction in English, I know I reread a lot. I will be reading a scene, I go, wow. And then I will reread that scene. There's something about rereading and going back over something that has an impact on me. And I wonder if that might be true for most people. And for second language learners, that might be vitally important because you might be a little slow reading the first time and miss things, or you might be reading too fast and miss things. It's the rereading part that gets you to maybe pick up a little more than you did the first time. And we talked about interaction earlier. Think about how you can interact with a written text. A lot of this, we do this when we read like a science book or a history book. We get a highlighter or a pencil and we mark things on the page, like this is important, or we underline it because it struck us as something interesting. When you read fiction, why not do that? Why not take a highlighter to your fiction, your novel, or your short story and go, ooh, that was an interesting sentence, and highlight it so you can remember it. It's that kind of stuff. You can interact with the text that way. You're not just reading passively, you're reading very actively. And another thing you do too is don't read alone, get a reading group. You have maybe it's 3 or 4 of you going to read the same novel. Get together once a week and discuss, what did you read in that chapter? What happened in the story? And then you open the book with each other. Well, did you see? Look at page 59. This is what I think he did this, that, and so on. So there's different ways to interact with a written text that aren't just sitting there by yourself.
What I do is I find some expressions that I think will be useful for my students or even for myself. I just take out my phone and just writing notes, and then maybe I can make a vocab list. Okay, I think that's all we have for today. Again, Dr. Van Patten, thank you so much for your time. And guys, go get a copy, Refuge. I'm gonna leave the link in the description box, and amazing book. Such an interesting story, and you wanna really check this out. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, and thank you to all your audience for listening, and good luck to everybody in your teaching and your learning endeavors. The best of luck.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
So I would like to wrap up this interview video by adding some thoughts and my interpretation of Dr. Van Patten's explanation about language acquisition to make it more digestible for you guys. So there's only one way to learn a language: by getting exposure to compelling, comprehensible input. That's what science tells us. However, we have to also factor in a lot of cultural context and all the political problems that we have. For example, in South Korea, especially in the education sector, we have this huge focus on grammar and reading and maybe writing, but little emphasis on speaking. And that's actually the problem that we're trying to resolve here, or find an answer to, because Koreans, they nail standardized English tests already. They don't need help with that, I guess. The problem at hand is those folks out there who can read, who can understand, but cannot speak English. And even though Dr. Van Patten was very careful about the term that we use, especially with the term idealistic, because that's science, there's no idealistic science and non-idealistic science. Science is science and facts are facts. That's what he was talking about. The reason why I use the word idealistic is because we have problems here in Korea, right? Political problems and educational problems that are unresolved to this day, right? And when we're trying to fix that system and we're trying to help students who are stuck in this educational system, we cannot just sit down and wait until students somehow get enough exposure to compelling input and have the luxury of having interaction with native speakers, because it costs money and time and energy too. Like, we all have life's priorities. I have a business to take care of, I have my family to support and all that. So at the end of the day, Krashen's theory is a theory and it's science and it's a fact. When we're trying to put that to use, things get a lot more complicated than that. So it's teachers' job to find a way to more effectively intervene in their students' language learning journey. And I think this is also very important that educators with power and authority, they should try to make a transition from this test-based education to more practical education that is based on, for example, Dr. Krashen's theory. Again, the problem is, in reality, we have economics to consider, logistics issues, and we have to take care of all this while making sure that this year's college entrance exam doesn't get disrupted by that. That's why in Korea, people say education is a century-long journey. So teachers and learners alike, we're all in this journey together. I think approaches to language acquisition shouldn't be black and white. It's a multifaceted, relative issue that requires a lot of consideration about multiple factors like money, logistics, and also teacher availability and so forth. So I hope you guys got some great insight from this interview with Dr. Van Patten. I myself learned a lot about Dr. Krashen's theory and what comprehensive input theory is supposed to mean to not just learners, but also to educators like myself as well. So again, Dr. Van Patten, thanks a lot for sharing your insight with us, and go order his book. The book is great. I'm gonna leave the URL that links to his website where you can get access to all his books. If you found this video helpful and insightful, make sure you subscribe. That's all I have for today. I'll see you guys in my next video. Bye-bye.